In the summer of 1914, Germany declared war on France. Both countries could boast an army of up to 4 million soldiers each. On the 4th of August, Britain entered the war against Germany. Initially, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, entered France with 240,000 men. Brandon lads were among them. A significant number of the BEF were reservists and territorials with limited experience of warfare. In hindsight, the Allies had greatly underestimated the German forces, leading to confusion and many casualties in the field. Within that first month of war, 2 Brandon lads were dead in the battlefield. William Dixon was a reservist with the 3rd Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, so he was one of the first to go into France and engage in the fighting with the German army. He did not fare well. Within a week of arriving in France, he experienced warfare for the first time. This was far removed from when he previously served with the British Army, saw out his term with the military and returned to a civilian life in Brandon. He engaged the German army near the River Aisne. 3 days of chaotic fighting ensued, where he was struck in the left shoulder by artillery shrapnel. Wounded and unable to contribute to the fighting, he made his way a mile from the front to a village where a makeshift hospital had been quickly put together. From here, army medics suggested his wound was too bad to be operated on, so he was shipped back to Britain and found himself lying in a hospital bed in Sheffield. In early October 1914, he returned to Brandon on medical leave and stayed with his family in Town Street. A local newspaper, the Bury Free Press, caught up with him during his stay and printed his account of his horrific experiences. "I was taken to a hospital in the village and that was bombarded and a corner knocked off it, so we had to shift to a farmhouse about 10 miles away. I heard they had bombarded that as well, but we'd left. I was brought to England with about 250 wounded from different units. The more seriously wounded were left behind." William was one of the lucky ones. He also told the newspaper about a time an artillery shell landed among him and his comrades, but fortunately it was a dud and did not explode. But he did have this advice about the German artillery. German shrapnel, on bursting, shoot forward, and the best way to avoid getting hit is to run towards them. The newspaper then remarked that William's advice would be useful to its readers if the long-threatened invasion of England by the Germans was to materialise. The front line was fluid, but only favoured the Germans. The Allies retreated and men were often left behind in the confusion. John Lynge had worked for a Brandon butcher, Frederick Gentle, before the war, but as a reservist for the Suffolk Regiment, he, like William Dixon, also found himself in the thick of it. Within 3 months he had gone from butcher to prisoner of war. Ambrose Field, serving with the Suffolk Regiment, was also taken prisoner by the Germans. In contrast, James Dyer, another Brandon lad in the same regiment, simply disappeared off the face of the earth. His family were beside themselves at not knowing if he was lying in hospital wounded, taken prisoner, or had been killed. So they spent months writing to the authorities to get some morsel of information. After 16 months, the military told them that they should just give up any hope of seeing him again. At Le Cateau, the British finally held the German army, and the German advance stalled. The armies dug in and defensive trenches began to appear along the front line. Robert Bullock of the 16th Lancers wrote a letter back to Brandon in which he graphically recalls his experience of those early trenches. In years gone by, he, as a lancer, would have ridden into war on horseback, but times had changed. His mode of transport was now the bicycle. As I have a few minutes to spare, I thought I would write to you a few lines of what we've been going through the last month. The worst really started on November the 4th, when we were ordered up to the trenches. I cannot state where the trenches are, as it is not allowed, but anyhow, on November the 4th we were exceedingly lucky, as from the early hours of morn until lights out, as we call it, there was one continuous roar of artillery and shrapnel, and nobody of our regiment got hit. But November the 5th I shall never forget. The Germans got the range of our trenches with their shells, but our boys would not give in, even after 3 lots got buried alive in the trenches by the artillery. We lost poor Captain Onslow, our squad leader, who had half his head blown off. Also Major Dixon, who was shot while going back to the trenches to cheer his men up, as on our left the report came through that the Germans had broken through the French lines. It was a mistake, and through that mistake Major Dixon was killed. I really forget our total loss that day, but it was the worst day that we have had. I had my cycle behind the hayricks, and every time we went back with a message we were followed by German snipers and shrapnel, which was a quarter of a mile from the trenches. About 9:30 the boys came to relieve us, and whilst they were relieving us they had 1 killed and 10 wounded, so you can guess what that was like. We then went back for 48 hours rest. We then came back to the trenches again. We had an easy time there until it was dark, then the snipers got at it, which makes it very uncomfortable. I enclose you a cutting from the paper which dates back to October the 15th, and it was there that we had a lively time. It was where our artillerymen handled one of their guns in the main street. When it was fired the noise was dreadful, and the poor women and the children screaming. It was shocking to see and hear them. I really cannot express what it was like that night, as the place was all lit up with burning houses, and the Germans were at one end of the town and us at the other. The civilian people in the town were too afraid to move on. It was also one of the nearest times I had of getting hit. I was sent along the main road and ran across a patrol of Germans about 300 yards from me. I was lucky enough to fire a round off just as 4 of them were getting into a kneeling position to have a shot at us. But as soon as I fired, they disappeared round the corner. Had I been a second later, they would have had me and my 3 other men. I had another narrow escape whilst our regiment were taking Mont de Cat. We were the leading squad and our patrols went out. Then our patrol ran across the German barricades, and at one of them we lost Sergeant Cooper and Private Richardson. Sergeant Cooper, seeing he was caught in an ambush, signalled to another patrol to turn around, but before he himself could turn around and escape, the Germans killed him. Another report came in to say that Mr. McNeil was killed and Mr. Avers was wounded, and it was their first time under fire. Then we moved forward, and I had a pot shot. The squad galloped across country, and we cyclists had to go by road. We had hardly turned the corner when 4 Germans came galloping round. Instead of coming for us, which would have been an easy thing for them, they turned sharply into a gap leading to a house. I threw my cycle down and rushed up to where they were going through. They were going for their lines across some fields, but 2 were missing. I fired at the 2 going across the fields. As I fired, one of them, who was caught in a barricade between a house and a fence, looked round. I turned my rifle on him, and I killed him with the first shot. The poor devil was only 10 yards from me, but I could not spare him after what they did to poor Richardson. Charles Edwards of the Royal Army Medical Corps wrote to his wife and described his compassion towards the Belgian refugees he had seen fleeing along the roads. When one sees the dreadful sights out here of the poor people leaving their homes for safety, and the poor dazed people crying as the Germans do not stop for what house they shell, it makes one feel sick, as they are seen by the thousand on the roads. The people at home don't know anything. Charles also gives an honest personal view of his experiences so far, which do not lie well with the patriotic fervour back home in Brandon. We have been having a rough time of it lately, but we've got to put up with it. As you know, we're out here to do a job. This is where some ought to be if they think they are brave, as there has been a few sights up to the present time that would make your blood run cold. No one can realise what it's like when the shells drop round about and you hear them going off. They make one look round as one does not know whether they are going to drop against one or not. We have had some narrow escapes now and then. So, Father would like to be where I am? Well, I'm thinking he'd like to be somewhere else when artillery is dropping around. We're glad to get out of the way, but we have to stand our ground. In another letter to his brother, he appears a little bit more upbeat and mentions he has seen other Brandon lads. I see some of the Brandon boys and have seen young Bob Bullock of the 16th Lancers. Then I saw Corporal Edgar Thompson of the 3rd Hussars and Ernie Carter, he is with the 4th Dragoon Guards. Please say best respects to the Brandon boys back home. Not all letters received by Brandon folk were written by their loved ones. There were times when a letter could only be written by a comrade. We have just heard that Charles Edwards had seen Ernie Carter of the Dragoon Guards. Ernie was probably a nickname for Leonard. Leonard Carter, as a young teenager, had been employed as an apprentice blacksmith in Brandon, but had found his way as a farrier into the Dragoon Guards. He was also among the first to see action against the German army. A comrade of Leonard's wrote home to Leonard's sister. It is my painful duty to inform you that your dear brother Leonard was killed in action at Leguer on about 11th of October. I and Leonard were the best of chums. I knew him when he worked at Great Barton. He died a hero's death. We buried him beside a railway station and erected a little wooden cross on his grave. Leonard was one of 4 brothers who were serving in the war in 1914. He had followed his oldest brother Albert into the army. Neither survived the war. When the men were called up in August, some had felt the war might be over by Christmas. The men in the fighting now knew otherwise. Ernest Thompson of the Royal Horse Artillery wrote home, "We shall be in the fighting line, I reckon, at Christmas, but never mind. Everybody's got to do it, and we will do it with a good heart." Christmas did offer some respite when German soldiers came out of their trenches and invited the British to do likewise. Nervously, both sides shook hands and swapped supplies in what would later be known as the Christmas Truce. It would not happen again. British commanders saw to that. But then, why should it? This was a war after all. One Brandon soldier, William Ashley, serving with the Rifle Brigade, wrote a letter home to say what he had seen from his viewpoint in the trenches at Christmas. On Christmas Eve, the Germans started shouting Christmas greetings, and of course we did the same. Then they started singing Christmas carols, and of course we joined in until it became a general thing. On Christmas Day, they continued being friendly and started coming out of their trenches towards ours. By midday, we were all mixed up together, shaking hands and exchanging tobacco and cigarettes. It was a sight I never expected seeing, or anyone else for that case. The majority of them say they are fed up with the war, so you see it wasn't such a bad Christmas after all. But of course, that sort of game is finished, and we are settling down to the realities of war again. I must say it was a treat to leave the trenches without being shot at. The first few months of war had not been kind to the Brandon lads serving on the front line. Dozens had either been wounded or taken prisoner. 3 had been killed. And yet, William Ashley had witnessed some humanity between sworn enemies. Any hope that this would continue into 1915 were dashed when a Brandon teenager was killed just hours into New Year's Day